Welcome to the Level 2 Safeguarding Training Package. Embedded within this training package are a series of questions. To gain compliance in this training, you'll be required to answer all of these questions. The answers to the questions can be found within the package, so it's recommended that you use the information provided to support you with your answers. To pass, you will need to achieve 100%. You'll find these questions back on ESR once you've read through this PowerPoint. The Safeguarding team are based in the Murray Building at James Cook, but we cover the whole of the South Tees Trust. We're here for support and advice in all matters relating to safeguarding and to ensure our staff are compliant with their roles and responsibilities. Who is responsible for safeguarding? Safeguarding is everybody's business and everyone's responsibility. And these taglines are taken from legislation and guidance produced by the government. We have the Care Act 2014, which sets out the criteria for safeguarding adults, the different categories of abuse and the roles and responsibilities different organisations have for safeguarding adults. Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018 provides guidance to professionals and organisations on their statutory responsibility to safeguard children, setting clear expectations. A common thread within both documents is that everybody is responsible for identifying and reporting concerns. Think family. Whilst many staff support either adults or children, it's important to think about both. The Think Family agenda recognises the significance of taking a whole family approach to safeguarding. The Social Care Institute for Excellence recognised, in a recent report, that organisations are often structured around the needs of either an adult or a child, and therefore professionals are reluctant to step outside of these boundaries. It's important that we do this, as many safeguarding reviews explored missed opportunities to protect vulnerable people because professionals did not consider the impact of the concerns on the wider family. Good information sharing is an important part of the safeguarding process and is essential for providing safe and effective care to patients. The duty to share information for individual care is as important as the duty to protect patient confidentiality. Health and social care professionals should have the confidence to share confidential information in the best interest of patients and service users within the framework set out by these principles. They should be supported by the policies of their employers, regulators and professional bodies. Under the GDPR and Data Protection Act 2018, you may share information without consent if, in your judgment, there is a lawful basis to do so, such as where safety may be at risk. You will need to base your judgment on the facts of the case. Take protective measures to reduce or remove the risk of harm. Gain consent from patients where possible. If you are unable to gain consent, balance the needs to share the information with the person's right to privacy. Be prepared to offer professional challenge, reporting a crime, and gathering evidence such as a body map, completion, photographs or statements will all help with the information sharing process. Information sharing is always a recommendation in safeguarding adult reviews. And to find out more, you can click on the links in the documents at the end of this session. These will take you to the Tees-wide Safeguarding Adults Board and South Tees Safeguarding Children's Partnership websites for their information sharing agreements. Here's our first question. Who's responsible for safeguarding patients? Make a note of your answer, ready for the end of this session. Safeguarding children. Safeguarding children. Who should we be safeguarding? Well, we safeguard all children under the age of 18 years old. Children might be patients in the hospital, they might be visiting patients in the hospital, or we might become aware that an adult we're caring for is putting a child in their care at risk of harm. In any of these circumstances, we should consider putting in a safeguarding referral to Children's Services. We also safeguard unborn babies too, and we can start this process between 16 to 18 weeks gestation. All children are vulnerable as they rely on others to meet their care and support needs. Some children, though, can be more vulnerable than others. Listed below are some factors that can increase a child's vulnerability. To find out more about each of these factors, download the handout at the end of this session. Some of these factors include children with disabilities, hyperactive children, unsettled or premature babies, children missing from home or school, the age of the child, youth offenders or children of asylum seekers, children that are born unwanted, young carers, looked after children, and children living with parental factors such as mental ill health and substance misuse, or children who are not in employment, education or training. Safeguarding children legislation. The importance of protecting children from harm and abuse is universally recognised. The legislative framework in the UK has been in force for many years. However, several high-profile cases and inquiries have led to the child protection system and legal framework that we have today. Links to further reading around all of the legislation linked to safeguarding is available in a handout that you can download at the end of this session. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child is an important agreement by countries who have promised to protect children's rights. Some elements of this legislation that feed into safeguarding include Article 19, a protection from all forms of violence. Children have the right to be protected from being hurt and mistreated physically or mentally. Article 6, survival and development. Children have the right to live. Article 27, adequate standard of living. Children have the right to a standard of living that is good enough to meet their physical and mental needs. Article 24, health and health services. Children have the right to good quality healthcare, the best healthcare possible, to safe drinking water, nutritious food, a clean and safe environment, and information to help them stay healthy. Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018 is a statutory guidance published by the government that sets out the criteria for protecting and promoting the welfare of children. The guidance suggests safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children includes 4 key areas: preventing impairment of children's health and development, protecting children from maltreatment, ensuring all children grow up in circumstances consistent with the provision of safe and effective care, and taking action to enable children to have the best outcomes. Looked after child. Looked after children are taken into the care of the local authority when it's no longer safe for them to remain at home. They might be cared for in a foster placement or a residential placement. Looked after children are vulnerable to abuse and neglect through abuse from others, returning often to abusive environments, going missing from care. They'll often have lower academic achievements, low self-esteem and self-harm, exploitation, and higher rates of teenage pregnancy. The North East region has some of the highest rates of looked after children in the country. If concerns are raised in regards to a looked after child, a referral should be made in line with standard reporting processes. Care leavers. When a looked after child turns 18, they will become a care leaver. Care leavers receive a supportive service from the leaving care team up to the age of 25. This includes having a named personal advisor. Care leavers can also be more vulnerable in adulthood due to their previous experiences. As well as all of the vulnerabilities we have already considered, care leavers might be at high risk of returning to abusive environments, having a lack of support, feeling isolated, physical and emotional health problems, not being in education, employment or training, engaging in criminal activity, and substance misuse. Parental responsibility. A person with parental responsibility is someone with the rights and responsibilities that parents have in law for a child, including the right to consent to medical treatment for them up to the age of 18. certain people will automatically have parental responsibility for a child. These include, but are not limited to, the mother, the father if he was married to the mother at the time of the child's birth, unmarried fathers if named on the child's birth certificate after the 1st of December 2003, or if it's been obtained through appropriate processes, such as adoption. Types of abuse. Abuse and neglect are forms of maltreatment. Somebody may abuse or neglect a child by inflicting harm or by failing to act to prevent harm. There are 4 main categories of abuse for safeguarding children, and they include physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. Abuse leads to experiences that are highly stressful and potentially traumatic. Occurring during childhood, these events are known as adverse childhood experiences. They can be a single event or a prolonged episode. Adverse childhood experiences. When a child suffers adverse childhood experiences, this can impact upon their health and well-being in adulthood. We often see children who grow into adults where they have experienced adversity in childhood suffer with poor health outcomes. There are increased risk of lung disease, heart disease, some cancers, diabetes, and other health conditions. They may experience premature mortality, are at increased likelihood to misuse substances, have mental health problems, and be in domestically abusive relationships. When the adult has children, the cycle can continue, as the child may then be exposed to inappropriate parental behaviours. Examples of adverse childhood experiences can include living in environments where there is domestic abuse, drug and alcohol misuse, or parental mental illness. We have some of the highest rates of domestic abuse in the UK in the North East region. Around 1 in 4 women and 1 in 5 men will experience domestic abuse, with around 1 in 5 children being victims of domestic abuse in their own right by witnessing or experiencing it in the family home. Redcar and Cleveland have some of the highest rates of drug and alcohol misuse in the UK. And we know that around 1 in 5 parents at some point in their lifetime will experience mental ill health. The toxic trio refers to instances where all 3 parental factors coexist within a family. It is referred to as the toxic trio as this can lead to a child living within an unsafe environment. Although all 3 elements within a household can be a toxic environment for a child, one element in isolation can also place a child at significant risk of harm, and staff should be alert to these factors when working with adults. Raising concerns. If you have concerns for a child or a disclosure has been made, you should take action in line with G55, our Safeguarding Children policy. This policy outlines the actions to take. When making a safeguarding referral, remember, raising a concern is the first stage in safeguarding children at risk of abuse or neglect. You are not being asked to prove the concerns, but only to log them and report them appropriately. Remember to stick to the facts. What have you seen? What have you heard? What have you been told? When making a referral for children, we use the electronic form found on the intranet. Referrals for children are made to the local authority the child lives within. We should always aim to seek consent from parents when making a safeguarding referral. However, in those cases where a child is thought to be at significant risk of harm, you can make a referral without parental consent. However, we should always seek to discuss our concerns with the parents and family involved, except in occasions where there might be fabricated or induced illness or sexual abuse disclosed. For information and advice on completing safeguarding referrals, you can speak to the safeguarding team. Question: What is the name of the statutory guidance that suggests safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children includes preventing impairment of children's health and development and protecting children from maltreatment? Remember to make a note of your answer because you will need this when you return to ESR. Safeguarding adults. Human rights. Human rights are based on shared values such as dignity, respect, fairness, equality and independence, and are legally bound in the Human Rights Act 1998. It's through this legislation and others that we have a responsibility to safeguard adults. Our human rights include Article 2, a right to life, Article 3, no one should be subjected to torture, inhumane or degrading treatment or punishment, Article 5, a right to liberty and security, and Article 8, the right to respect for private and family life. Adult safeguarding means to work with an individual to protect their right to live in safety, free from abuse, harm and neglect. Most adults are able to meet their own personal needs and prevent themselves from coming to harm. So which adults need safeguarding? Adults with care and support needs that are experiencing or are at risk of abuse and neglect, and as a result of those care needs are unable to protect themselves from harm. Care and support needs can often be overlooked if they're not obvious. Many patients with care and support needs have physical or mental health issues that cannot be seen. How do we know then if an adult has care and support needs? A learning disability, a reduced ability to understand new or complex information and cope independently. Autism, a condition that affects how people communicate and interact with others. Mental health, including depression and anxiety, so worrying more than is usual, and it includes addiction or eating disorders. Dementia, including memory loss, difficulties with thinking, problem solving, speech or language. Physical health, such as an enduring health condition like diabetes, asthma, arthritis or cancer. It can be managed but not cured, and people as a result of these might rely on others to meet some of their care and support needs. Frailty, a symptom of natural aging with multiple long-term conditions, including a loss of fitness and reserves. And physical disability, a substantial and long-term negative effect on your ability to do normal daily activities. The 6 key principles of safeguarding were first introduced by the Department of Health in 2011, but have since been embedded into the Care Act. These 6 principles apply to all health and care settings. They should inform the ways in which professionals engage with people at risk of abuse, harm or neglect, and they include empowerment, so people being supported and encouraged to make their own decisions and includes informed consent. Prevention, it's better to take action before harm occurs. Proportionality, taking the least intrusive response appropriate to the risk presented. Protection, support and representation for those in greatest need. Partnership, local solutions through services working with their communities. Communities have a part to play in preventing, detecting and reporting neglect and abuse. And finally, accountability. Accountability and transparency in safeguarding practice. Types of abuse. Abuse and neglect are forms of maltreatment. Somebody may abuse or neglect an adult by inflicting harm or by failing to act to prevent harm. The Care Act 2014 defines the 10 categories of abuse for adult safeguarding, and they include physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. Self-neglect, organisational abuse, modern slavery, financial abuse, domestic abuse, and discriminatory abuse. And we'll look at these in more detail as we go through this session. Raising concerns. If you have concerns for an adult or a disclosure has been made, you should take action in line with G62, our Safeguarding Adults at Risk of Abuse policy. This policy outlines the actions to take where you have concerns for the welfare of an adult with care and support needs. When making a referral, remember, Raising a concern is the first stage in safeguarding adults at risk of abuse or neglect. For example forms to be completed, you can have a look on the intranet. Raising concerns. If you suspect an adult is experiencing or at risk of experiencing abuse or neglect, you should discuss your concerns with the adult unless it is not safe to do so. Making safeguarding personal is about including adults in decisions made about them. If you have reasonable cause for concern, you should seek their consent to a referral. When making a referral for an adult, we use the electronic form found on the intranet. Referrals for adults are made to the local authority where the abuse occurred, so please select the right local authority area when submitting your concerns. Whilst we all play a part in safeguarding adults, under the Care Act 2014, the local authority is responsible for undertaking Section 42 inquiries when a safeguarding referral is made in respect of concerns relating to an adult. An inquiry may take the form of a conversation with the individual concerned. It may need the involvement of other organisations or individuals, and it may require a more formal process, perhaps leading to a formal multi-agency plan to ensure the well-being of the adult concerned. The local authority can ask other agencies to carry these out on their behalf, such as health services. Here's another question. Please make a note of your answers ready for your assessment at the end. Complete this extract. Adult safeguarding means to work with an individual to protect their right to live in safety, free from abuse, harm and neglect. Most adults are able to meet their own personal needs and prevent themselves from coming to harm. This is why, according to the Care Act, we safeguard adults with and needs that are to protect themselves from harm. We're now going to take a closer look at the different categories of abuse. The following forms of abuse can occur in both adults and children. These include physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, and neglect. Physical abuse includes any pain, suffering, or injury that is willfully inflicted. Physical abuse includes hitting, shaking, throwing, kicking, scolding, suffocating, and any other ways of inflicting pain on children or adults with care and support needs. It also includes giving children or adults with care and support needs harmful substances such as drugs, alcohol, and poisons. Indicators of physical abuse. There are many indicators of physical abuse, but some common ones to look out for include bruising, oral injuries, burns and scalds, head injuries, bites, fractures. When children or adults display a change in behaviour, particularly when another person enters the room, injuries that are in the form or shape of an implement, and often children or adults will present frequently to services for support. We should be particularly concerned about an absent or unsuitable explanation for an injury, injuries that occur on non-mobile babies or children, and injuries on non-mobile adults. Any bruising or a mark that might be bruising in a child or adult who is not independently mobile should be immediately referred to social care for an urgent medical opinion to be sought. For babies and children, social care will request a paediatric medical opinion. You can find out more by visiting South Tees Safeguarding Children's Partnership page, looking at the Tees procedures for non-mobile children. As we've seen, physical abuse can take many forms. In the following slides, we'll look at additional types of abuse that are considered physical, including fabricated and induced illness, physical chastisement, FGM, and breast ironing. Fabricated and induced illness also now covers the term perplexing presentations. Fabricated and induced illness is when a parent or carer exaggerates or deliberately causes symptoms of illness in a child. Perplexing presentations has been introduced to try and capture examples or cases of FII before they lead to significant harm for children. Examples of FII that we have seen include adding blood or glucose to urine samples or on clothing to suggest unusual bleeding, withholding food resulting in the child failing to develop physically and mentally at the expected rate, leading to unnecessary investigations, or withholding required medication to prevent control of a genuine illness or condition, exacerbating the signs and symptoms of that condition. FII can result in physical and emotional abuse and neglect as a result of parental actions and doctors' responses to these. We must be careful about sharing concerns of FII to family members without seeking advice from the safeguarding team. When is a smack not just a smack? In the UK, do you know if it is illegal to smack our children? The answer is that at present it is not illegal in England for parents to smack their child if it is deemed to have been reasonable punishment under the Children's Act 2004. In some instances, though, the use of force can be considered physical abuse. A referral should be made when a child is left with a visible mark or injury, an implement is used, an injury is to the child's face, where there are concerns regarding the use of force or loss of control, or where there are concerns regarding the child's reaction. Female genital mutilation, or FGM, is defined as procedures that involve partial or total removal of the external female genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical purposes, often described as circumcision. Unlike with men, there is usually no medical reason for this. Under the Female Genital Mutilation Act 2003, it is illegal within the UK to perform FGM on a female child or woman, or to assist a girl to mutilate her own genitalia, assist a non-UK person to mutilate overseas a girl's genitalia, or to fail to protect a girl from risk of FGM. Under the Female Genital Mutilation Act 2003, regulated health, social care professionals and teachers are required to report cases of FGM in girls under 18 where they have made a disclosure or which they have identified in the course of their professional work to the police. You can do this by contacting the police on 101. It may also be necessary to make a safer referral for children in these cases. For more information, always consult the safeguarding team. Breast ironing, also known as breast flattening, is the process whereby young pubescent girls' breasts are ironed, massaged, or pounded down through the use of hard or heated objects in order for the breast to disappear or delay the development of the breast entirely. Similarly to FGM, the practice originated in Western and Central Africa and most commonly occurs in these areas, often performed on girls during adolescence. Again, very similarly to FGM, the girl may not recognise the practice as abuse, therefore is unlikely to make a disclosure. Question. List 5 types of physical abuse. Thinking about all the examples of physical abuse that we've explored during the last few slides. Emotional or psychological abuse. Emotional abuse. Emotional abuse in children is when a parent or carer behaves in a way that is likely to seriously affect their child's emotional development. This can include constant rejection and denial of affection through continual severe criticism and humiliation. Constant criticism, preventing the child or adult from socializing, threats of harm or abandonment, and threats of inappropriate punishment can all be considered examples of emotional abuse. Willful infliction of mental suffering by a person in a position of trust categorizes emotional or psychological abuse for adults, and it includes the willful failure of a person in a position of trust to prevent mental suffering inflicted by a third party. There are many indicators of emotional or psychological abuse. Some of those can include changes to a person's behavior, particularly going silent when a certain person enters the room, being overly affectionate towards strangers and displaying attention-seeking behaviors, having a lack of confidence or low self-esteem, difficulties with sleeping and concentration. They may also present as anxious, weary, tearful, or withdrawn, and their behaviour and language might be inappropriate for their age due to a lack of social interaction with others. They may also misuse substances and self-harm. Question: how can you tell if someone may be suffering from emotional abuse? Give one indicator. Make sure you keep your answers ready for the assessment at the end. Sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is when a child or young person is pressurized, forced, or tricked into taking part in any kind of sexual activity with an adult or another young person. This can range from inappropriate touching to sexual intercourse, but it also includes non-contact offences such as encouraging a child to look at pornographic materials, witness sexual acts, and grooming offences. For adults, sexual violence and abuse is any behaviour of a sexual nature which is unwanted and takes place without consent or understanding. Sexual abuse can include inappropriate touching or looking, sexual photography or child abuse images, indecent exposure, rape or sexual assault, sexual teasing or innuendo, and sexual acts to which the person has not consented to, and that includes where a person doesn't have the capacity to consent. If the survivor or the victim is a child, this must be reported to Children's Social Care, who will notify the police. Age, consent and the law. The age of consent for sexual activity in the UK is 16, but individuals can remain vulnerable to sexual abuse and exploitation under the age of 16, as well as over the age of sexual consent. A person aged 13 or under, in law, is deemed not to have the capacity or maturity to be able to consent to sex, and it is important in all cases that these are referred to the police and social services. We may also treat high-risk offenders in our trust. If a high-risk offender is attending services, they may have a management plan in place. This will be indicated on CAMIS and available on Symphony. These management plans are put in place by MAPA, the Multi-Agency Protection Arrangements. These are arrangements set to manage high-risk offenders within the community, and our security team will liaise with MAPA on a regular basis. Question: true or false? Sexual violence and abuse is any behaviour of a sexual nature which is unwanted and takes place without consent or understanding. Neglect. Neglect of children includes the persistent failure to meet a child's basic, physical and/or psychological needs, likely to result in the serious impairment of the child's health or development, as defined within Working Together to Safeguard Children 2018. Neglect of adults is defined as a failure to provide the degree of care which a reasonable person in that position of responsibility would give. For those reliant upon others for their care and support needs, it can be life-threatening. Signs of neglect. Neglect can include the following examples: a failure to provide adequate food and nutrition and ensure it is eaten, poor school attendance or non-attendance at services, failure to provide or maintain social contact, speech, language and communication difficulties due to a lack of social interaction with others, a delay or failure in seeking medical treatment, living in a dirty accommodation, failure to thrive, failure to support with personal hygiene, provide appropriate clothing, warmth, food and shelter. Neglect and child not brought. When children are not brought to health appointments, this can evidence neglect of a child's health and development needs. Parents or carers may regularly cancel and rearrange appointments for children, which has the same outcome for the child as not being brought. It's important that we use current terminology, such as child not brought, when children miss routine appointments, rather than outdated language such as did not attend. We also have a child not brought policy on the intranet, which guides professionals as to what to do when a child routinely is not brought to a health appointment. Neglect in a healthcare setting. It is a difficult reality, but patients are harmed in healthcare settings. Our Safeguarding Adults quarterly reports show that in the majority of cases where safeguarding referrals are made in relation to trust practice, these are related to neglect. The most common examples include neglect related to discharge arrangements, pressure ulcer management, and medication. Some other indicators of neglect in healthcare settings include untreated pain, unmanaged physical or mental illness, poor wound care, illness or injury due to omissions of critical medication, hypothermia, being unkempt, i.e. a lack of oral hygiene, and a lack of reassessments of risks, such as following a fall. When a child fails to In the next few slides, we're going to look at the following types of abuse, which can occur most commonly in adults, but in some cases, children can be affected too, and we'll look at this in more detail as we visit each slide. Self-neglect, financial abuse, domestic abuse, modern slavery, discriminatory abuse, and organisational abuse. Self-neglect. It only occurs in adults and includes a wide range of behaviours such as neglecting to care for one's personal hygiene, health or surroundings, and includes behaviours such as hoarding. Examples of self-neglect can include inadequate personal hygiene, not taking medication, poor and unsafe living conditions, a lack of heat, a lack of proper nutrition, and hoarding. Safeguarding Adult reviews have identified a connection between patients at self-neglect and diabetic care management. Staff often find it difficult to engage patients who are self-neglecting. We should always consider, have we tried to improve engagement with the individual? Firstly, starting with trying to understand the cause of the self-neglect in the first place and provide help and support to overcome the challenges that that individual is facing. Taking small steps, empowering the individual, and providing them with choice and control over the decisions made is important with self-neglect. Financial abuse. Defined by the Citizens Advice Bureau, financial abuse is when someone exerts excessive financial control, harm, or exploitation of another. According to the Tees-wide Safeguarding Adults Board recent annual report, we have seen an increase in concerns relating to financial abuse in the last 12 months. Examples of financial abuse might include when the family or others show unusual interest in the assets of a person, a lack of receipts for transactions carried out on behalf of the person, unexplained withdrawal of funds from accounts, or missing personal possessions. Domestic abuse. Domestic abuse can include any incident of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. Under the Domestic Abuse Act 2021, children have now been identified as victims of domestic abuse in their own right, and those same principles apply equally to children under the age of 16. Abuse can include psychological, physical, sexual, financial, and emotional forms of abuse. Both males and females can be victims of domestic abuse, with around 1 in 4 women experiencing abuse at some point in their life, and 1 in 6 men. The Trust have a hospital independent domestic violence advisor who can support staff and patients that are experiencing domestic abuse. To find out more about their role, search IDVA on the Trust intranet. Domestic abuse and MARAC. MARAC meetings are victim-focused, multi-agency meetings where statutory and voluntary agency representatives share information about individual high-risk victims of domestic abuse to produce a coordinated action plan to increase victim safety. Any practitioner who has received a disclosure of domestic abuse should consider if a referral to MARAC is necessary by assessing the risk of the victim through the completion of a DASH risk assessment form. DASH stands for Domestic Abuse, Sexual Abuse and Honour-Based Violence. These forms are available if you search IDVA on the intranet. Any practitioner can submit a referral to MARAC if a patient scores 14 or more on the DASH risk assessment. However, You can use your professional judgment in all cases, and if you feel it warrants a referral, even though they haven't met the 14 score, you can still make this to MARAC. In the 2021 Domestic Abuse Act, children have been identified as victims of domestic abuse in their own right, either as victims within their own relationships or as victims by witnessing or being involved in domestic abuse within the family home. Approximately 1 in 5 children have been exposed to domestic abuse. Where children are exposed to domestic abuse, they are more likely to become either perpetrators or victims of abuse. Risk to children from domestic abuse can include a risk of physical injuries, fear, emotional abuse and trauma, and it can lead to aggressive learned behaviours. There's also a health risk, with anxiety, depression and low mood being common factors of children that experience domestic abuse. To find out more about the risk of domestic abuse on young children, search domestic abuse on the intranet. Modern slavery. Modern slavery, which includes human trafficking, is the recruitment, movement, harbouring or receiving of children, women or men through the use of force, coercion, abuse of vulnerability, deception or other means for the purpose of exploitation. Individuals may be trafficked into, out of or within the UK. Discriminatory abuse is any instance where a person discriminates against an individual because of their difference. The Equality Act 2010 identifies a number of protected characteristics. It's unlawful to discriminate against a person or group of individuals due to any of the following characteristics: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. Discriminatory abuse, reasonable adjustments. The Equality Act 2010 places a legal duty on services to make reasonable adjustments for people with a disability. So when accessing services, they are not put at a substantial disadvantage compared to people without a disability. Reasonable adjustments include removing physical barriers to access, but also include making alterations to policies, procedures, staff training and services to ensure that they work equally well for people with disabilities. At South Tees, all staff are required to complete mandatory learning disability training. We also have the Learning Disability Acute Care Diamond Pathway, the Hospital Passport, the Hospital Communication Book and the Carer's Passport, which are all considered ways of supporting you to support patients and make reasonable adjustments where needed. To find out more, pop any of those search terms into the intranet. Safeguarding and organisational abuse. Organisational abuse is neglect or poor professional practice as a result of the structures, policies, processes and practices within an organisation. According to the Tees-wide Safeguarding Adults Board recent annual survey and report, organisational abuse is one of the least commonly understood forms of abuse and therefore often goes unreported. But organisational abuse can include a lack of management overview and support, a lack of flexibility, choice and reasonable adjustments for service users, poor care or no visitors. Question: true or false? Modern slavery happens in our local communities and it's everyone's responsibility to report it. Contextualised safeguarding. Contextualised safeguarding is an approach to understanding and responding to young people's experiences of harm beyond their families. Safeguarding children is about protecting children from harm and abuse within the family setting, but contextualised safeguarding recognises that as young people grow and develop, they are influenced by a whole range of environments and people outside of their family. For example, in school or college, in the local community, in their peer groups or online. Children and young people may encounter risks in any of these environments. It recognises that the different relationships that young people form outside of the family can feature violence and abuse. You can click to watch the video to understand more. Contextual safeguarding looks at how we can best understand these risks, engage with children and young people, and help to keep them safe. As we've seen, young people can be exposed to a risk of harm and abuse from outside the family setting. This risk doesn't end when they turn 18. Many adults can also be at risk of harm in the community, including from sexual exploitation, trafficking, forced marriage, modern slavery, criminal exploitation and gang violence, and electronic media abuse. We'll explore these in more detail in the next slides. Sexual exploitation. Sexual exploitation is a form of sexual abuse. It occurs where an individual or group takes advantage of an imbalance of power to coerce, manipulate, or deceive a person into sexual activity in exchange for something the victim needs or wants, or for the financial advantage or increased status of the perpetrator or facilitator. Both adults and children can be sexually exploited. Victims can be male or female, and children as young as 10 in this local area have been sexually exploited. The victim may have been sexually exploited even if the activity appears consensual. Sexual exploitation does not always involve physical contact. It can also occur through the use of technology. Perpetrators of sexual exploitation can be either male or female, any ethnicity or any religion, an isolated perpetrator or part of a network, children under the age of 18, family members, and even includes people in a position of trust or professionals. We've seen an increase of more than 80% of abuse perpetrated by people in positions of trust since 2014. Human trafficking is the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring or receipt of persons for the purpose of exploitation. It encompasses human trafficking and slavery, servitude and forced or compulsory labour. It consists of three basic components: action, means, and purpose of exploitation. All three components must be present in an adult trafficking case, but for child trafficking, the means component is not required. In human trafficking cases, exploitation can take many forms, including sexual exploitation, forced labour, slavery, servitude, forced criminality, and removal of organs. Some people may not be victims of human trafficking, but still be victims of modern slavery if they have been subject to slavery, servitude, and forced or compulsory labour. Forced marriage. A forced marriage, not to be confused with an arranged marriage, is a marriage where one or both people do not, or in some cases, particularly with people with a learning disability, cannot consent to the marriage, and duress or abuse is used. Victims can be pressurised in many different ways, including physical violence and sexual violence, psychological pressure and fear, tricking the victim, or financial control. We often see cases of honour-based violence linked to forced marriage. Victims' ages range from babies to people post-retirement. Cases involving young children often involve the promise of a future marriage rather than an imminent marriage. Criminal exploitation. County lines is a term used to describe gangs and organised criminal networks involved in exporting illegal drugs into one or more importing areas within the UK, using dedicated mobile phone lines or other form of deal line. They are likely to exploit children and vulnerable adults to move and store the drugs and money, and they will often use coercion, intimidation, violence, and weapons. There are several signs to look out for that may indicate someone is involved in county lines. These include repeatedly going missing from school or home and being found in other areas, having money, new clothes, or electronic devices, and they can't explain how they paid for them, getting a high number of texts or phone calls, being secretive about who they're speaking to, a decline in school or work performance, and significant changes in emotional or physical well-being. If adults who work with children don't understand that county lines is a form of abuse, they may see children involved in county lines activity as criminals rather than as victims of criminal exploitation. This can often lead to the child not getting the safeguarding support and protection they need. County lines can affect children under the age of 18, but also affect vulnerable adults. It can be exploitative, even if the activity appears consensual. It will often involve force, enticement, violence, or even threats of violence. And it can be perpetrated by either males or females, and by individuals or groups. But it always involves an imbalance of power, either due to age, gender, cognitive ability, physical strength, or status. When we think about young people transitioning to adulthood, we need to remember that exploitation doesn't end when they turn 18. Many exploited adults have suffered adverse childhood experiences. For many young people and adults, it can often lead to poor mental health or see them develop health-harming behaviours. It can affect decisions they make around their treatment in hospital. It's important to use professional curiosity and to consider the wider context of a patient's decision. One thing we notice as young people make the transition to adulthood is that there is an assumption that at 18 they have the capacity to make decisions for themselves and that they decide to continue with criminality. As a result, there is a shift in our perspective, and due to negative cultures and victim-blaming language, opportunities to safeguard these young people are often missed. There are many risks associated with using technology. These risks apply to both children and adults with care and support needs. Criminal networks use social media to groom and recruit children for county lines. They may send them direct messages known as DMs or share messages to wider groups as stories or posts. Different ways that they use social media includes advertising drugs through photos, emojis and price lists, posting statuses that show money, new drugs or when a dealer is open for business, dealers sharing stories to followers and using social media platforms to expand their network with suggested friends. They also advertise for workers or runners to recruit people into county lines activity, and they often use hashtags linked to drugs. Health inequalities. Health inequalities can be defined as differences in health status between different groups and populations. Compared to the national population, Middlesbrough has significant inequalities, being one of the most deprived authorities in England. The health of people in Middlesbrough is generally worse than the England average. Middlesbrough is one of the 20% most deprived authorities in England, and about 33% of children live in low-income families. The life expectancy in Middlesbrough is around 11.7 years lower for men and 12 years lower for women. Homelessness and the duty to refer. A person is homeless if they have no accommodation in the UK, and a person is threatened with homelessness if they are likely to become homeless within the next 56 days. If you become aware of a patient, or if a patient makes a disclosure to you that they are homeless or threatened with homelessness, under the Homelessness Reduction Act, we have a duty to make a referral to the local authority on their behalf. The Homelessness Reduction Act placed a duty on local housing authorities to intervene at earlier stages to prevent homelessness in their areas and to provide homelessness services to all those who are eligible. Question. The recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring or receipt of persons for the purpose of exploitation is known as what? Safeguarding and professional curiosity. As we've seen, people of any age can be vulnerable to all kinds of abuse. Unfortunately, many vulnerable people struggle to tell someone what is happening to them. There can be many reasons for this, including peer pressure not to tell, not knowing who to tell, that fear of being disbelieved, the fear of repercussions, not understanding that they're being abused, being embarrassed or ashamed, loving their abuser who is often known to them, often a parent, carer, husband, wife, and lacking the vocabulary to disclose. It's important that we give patients the safety and confidence to open up to us. We should use professional curiosity to explore what is happening within a family. Prevent. Prevent training is completed as a statutory training programme at the start of your employment with the Trust. This is an update to remind you of what Prevent is. Prevent is the government's strategy aimed at stopping people becoming terrorists or supporting terrorist-related activity. It's a mechanism for safeguarding vulnerable children and adults who may be drawn into terrorist activities. We know that children and adults with care and support needs can be vulnerable to radicalisation, particularly where other vulnerabilities exist. We need to consider that when adults such as parents are vulnerable to radicalisation, it may also place their child at risk of harm. In theory, anyone can be vulnerable to radicalisation. However, certain factors may increase a person's susceptibility to being radicalised. These include being isolated from friends and family, spending too much time online, being bereaved or experiencing illness in the family, or experiencing a deterioration in your mental health. Extremist groups are known to be exploiting these vulnerabilities. Whilst the threat may seem low, it's important to know how to report concerns should they arise. For any unusual behaviour or language or inappropriate comments or injuries, please report non-urgent concerns to the safeguarding team. If you do have any urgent concerns and require an immediate response, contact the police on 999. Mental Capacity Act. The Mental Capacity Act provides the legal framework for acting and making decisions on behalf of a person who lacks the capacity to make them for themselves. The Act provides patients with a right to consent. Consent should be given voluntarily, be informed, and made with capacity. It also protects those that are unable to give consent by ensuring any decisions made are in their best interests. There are 5 key principles of the Act that help guide our practice and help us to understand it better. Let's take a look at them first. The Act is intended to be enabling and supportive of people who lack capacity, not restrictive or controlling. The 5 principles are the values of the Act that ensure people are protected. The first principle suggests capacity should always be assumed, unless you are able to prove, on the balance of probabilities, that a person lacks capacity. The second key principle tells us to take all practicable steps to making decisions for patients. We should make sure that patients are provided with information in a way that meets their needs, and that we make all reasonable adjustments to support their understanding. The third principle suggests that a person does not lack capacity just because they make an unwise decision. We all think and feel differently about certain things, and individuality should be considered. The fourth principle tells us that any act done or decision made must be in a person's best interest, and we should consider a person's past and present wishes and feelings. The fifth principle ensures that the least restrictive option is applied. Professionals should consider the impact of each decision on the individual involved and ensure there is no less restrictive option before going ahead. Who is responsible for assessing capacity? The person responsible for assessing capacity should be the person directly concerned with the individual at the time that the decision needs to be made. This means that different people will be involved in assessing someone's capacity to make different decisions at different times. When should we assess a person's capacity? We need to assess capacity when there is doubt about a person's ability to make a decision. Have you noticed a change in their behaviour, or has a family member raised concerns? Are you aware of something that could be affecting their capacity? Think about the long and short-term factors. How do we assess capacity? The assessment is a 2-stage process. Firstly, we need to determine if there is an impairment of the mind. If the answer to this is no, then we don't need to go any further. We should consider the first principle of the Act and assume they have capacity. If the answer is yes, then we move to stage 2 of the assessment. Stage 2 answers 4 questions. Firstly, can they understand the information being given to them? Remember, Principle 2 is to take all practicable steps to support the patient to understand the decision being made. Have you given them the information in a way that meets their needs? Secondly, can they retain the information? Can they hold on to it long enough to use it to make a decision? They then must be able to consider the information, weigh it up, and use it to make the decision. Finally, they need to be able to communicate their decision. This doesn't always need to be in writing. You can be creative with the ways the patient communicates this information. Previous cases have seen patients blinking and tapping their hands to indicate yes or no. If a patient answers yes to all 4 assessment questions, they have the capacity to make the decision. If they answer no to just one of them, they don't have capacity and their best interest should be considered. A best interest decision follows a process. If it is determined that a patient does not have the capacity to make a decision, the decision should then be made in their best interest. The mental capacity assessment form provides a checklist of criteria to ensure this is being done and includes avoiding discrimination, waiting for a patient to regain capacity if appropriate, and taking into account their wishes and special considerations. Some patients may have made an advanced decision when they had the capacity to do so. If this applies to the required medical treatment, this should be utilised. If a patient has a lasting power of attorney, or LPA, they have appointed someone to make this decision on their behalf. It is essential that this is seen by staff and a copy kept in the patient's notes. The lasting power of attorney should be for health and welfare rather than for property and affairs, and should be stamped by the Office of the Public Guardian. As well as an LPA, there are other decision-making authorities that friends and family members may have. Staff should be aware of all the different authorities in order to ensure that they are acting appropriately on behalf of the patient. An LPA is an advanced decision made when a person has capacity to nominate someone to manage either their health and welfare or property and affairs once they no longer have the capacity to do so themselves. A deputyship is when a person lacks capacity to make decisions due to serious illness, dementia, or a learning disability. Usually, a relative or close friend can apply to be a deputy and make decisions on their behalf. An appointeeship is when a person lacks the capacity and is entitled to welfare benefits. A friend or relative can apply to manage these benefits on their behalf, but they can't make decisions around health and welfare. Involving an independent mental capacity advocate, or IMCA. IMCAs are mandatory for the unbefriended when there are no friends or family to make decisions that relate to the provision of serious medical treatment, or a move to another hospital for more than 28 days, or a move to another care home for longer than 8 weeks. When a person is deemed to lack the capacity to make a decision, an IMCA should be appointed to act as their voice. The IMCA is there to support the patient and ensure their wishes are considered. An IMCA is mandatory if the patient is unbefriended. Carry on acting in the best interest of the patient until the IMCA is appointed. An IMCA has the right to look in patient records, request a second opinion, and dispute the outcome of a best interest decision. IMCAs should be appointed when providing, withdrawing, or withholding treatment in circumstances where a single treatment is being proposed and there is a fine balance between its benefits and the risks. There is a choice of treatment and a decision as to which one to use is finely balanced, or where treatment would involve serious consequences for the patient, including withdrawal of treatment. Restraint. Here are some guidelines for applying the use of restraint. Restraint should only be used where the person reasonably believes that the restraint is necessary and in the best interest of a patient who lacks capacity. Mental Capacity Act assessments should be completed for all patients where they're unable to consent to the use of any form of restraint. Restraint must also be used to prevent harm, and the amount or type of restraint and the amount of time it lasts must be proportionate to the likelihood and seriousness of harm. What do we mean by DOLS? DOLS are the deprivation of liberty safeguards, and they protect patients that don't have the capacity to consent to being cared for or treated in a care home or hospital. So if we determine that a person lacks capacity to consent to their stay and care or treatment in hospital, we must follow the legal framework set out by the government to protect vulnerable people's rights, such as the right to freedom. Human rights are based on shared values such as dignity, respect, fairness, equality and independence, and are legally bound by the Human Rights Act 1998. Article 5 stipulates that we have a right to liberty and security. Nobody shall be deprived of his liberty save in accordance with the following cases with a procedure prescribed by law. When is a person deprived of their liberty? A person is deprived of their liberty if they are held in a hospital or care home for care and treatment and they cannot consent to be there. If a person is under continuous supervision or control by ward staff, they are also deprived of their liberty. Preventing a person from leaving the care home or hospital would also deprive them, and this applies even when the person is not trying to leave. Mental Health Act. Detention under the Mental Health Act should only be authorised when there is the presence of a mental health disorder, when the disorder is of a nature or degree which warrants detention in hospital, for the protection and safety of the person or others, and where appropriate treatment is available. The decision to apply a section is a medical one made by a doctor, but the process is facilitated by the clinical matrons at James Cook, out-of-hours patient flow team, or at the Friarage, the nurse practitioners. The matrons carry the necessary paperwork, which should be signed by both the doctor and the matron, and once the matron has read the patient their rights, the detention becomes lawful. There are a number of sections that you might hear being in place within the hospital. Section 136 is a police holding power for 24 hours, which can be extended for an additional 12 hours on a 136B. Under the police holding power, police can detain a person who appears to be suffering from a mental disorder in a public place, removing them to a place of safety in the interest of that person or for the protection of others. Usually this would be outpatient areas such as the emergency department. Section 5.2 is for hospital use, allowing patients to be detained for up to 72 hours to prevent the patient from discharging themselves before there is time to arrange for an assessment under the Mental Health Act. Following this assessment, should the patient require further detention, we would often use a Section 2 or a Section 3. These allow for further assessment and for treatment without consent for the mental health disorder. These can allow patients to be detained in hospital for up to 28 days or up to 6 months. The final question on ESR will be a declaration. I confirm I have completed this training session to the best of my ability and will refer to the information pack for more information on safeguarding. Before you can be confirmed as compliant, you must now complete the 10 questions from this session on ESR. In addition to this training session, below is the link to the Level 2 Safeguarding Training Information Pack, which contains all the additional information, links to videos and resources from this package to support your learning. Please take the time to read through this document and some of the links and share it widely with your colleagues. You can also use it as a reference guide to come back to in the future. As this is a video, you may not be able to access the link, but if you simply search Level 2 Safeguarding Training Supplementary Package on the staff intranet, you'll find the details. Thank you for listening.